And then all of a sudden the experience shifted, and the people he saw started shifting and transforming into like demonic creatures. And eventually one of them leads him down into hell. And he talked about how if he had been resuscitated in the early stages of his experience, he would have thought he was fine. He would have thought he was going to go to heaven just like he did when he died the first time. And that's really what set me down this path where, okay, here's this guy who he has this really overt deception happening in his experience. I wonder if there are other deceptions that could be happening throughout the space. Welcome to a unique episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. With my new book releasing in May, I am going to do a whole series of episodes where I let some of my author friends hijack the podcast, and we'll turn the tables, flip the microphones around, and they're actually going to interview me about my new book. Today, I'm honored to have my friend J. Warner Wallace, very well known for the Cold Case Christianity series, talk to me about the NDE Conspiracy. So, Jim, I'll let you take over, man. We'll see where this goes. It's still a little weird for me to be interviewed after all these years.
I know, right? Well, what's good about it is this gives people who are your friends, who are authors, who maybe don't have an interview podcast of their own, because I used to do that once in a while, but I haven't done that in years. But I want to ask questions about it, and I'd love to be in that space. I've just got a different kind of life. So this gives me a chance to ask you questions. And we go back a long way, Shaun, if you think about it. One of the very few first interviews I think I ever did on Cold Case Christianity, which was the first book I wrote, was you. And we've kind of been back and forth all this. This is 10 plus years, 11 years. So I'm just really grateful for that friendship. But yeah, so you're talking about something with near-death experiences in this next book that I have always been fascinated with, because people write to me all the time, like, is the Shroud of Turin and another evidence we could use in the overall cumulative case for Christianity? I'm, as a Christian apologist, those are the kinds of things I typically assemble, right? I worked murders for so many years in Los Angeles County that I often get these questions. What do you make of these near-death experiences that are so often reported? And you and I have people we know, like a good friend of mine is Gary Habermas, and he's written about near-death experiences. Everyone's got something to say, it seems, about it. So I get this question asked a lot. And I just then I don't often know. I kind of felt like you did when you wrote this book, but I also know as an author that I want people to read your book, because it's so rich, and you even offer a template about how we can examine near-death experiences. And you also talk about a couple of other things that I think are even more important than NDEs, like the shared death experiences. I think are really important. Anyway, the point is, I want people to read the book, but I have a few questions that at least get people, I don't want to unpack the entire book for you, but I do want to ask a few questions about it, because this is an unusual line of research. I mean, everyone's read something. But you haven't. I want to know what it is that got you interested, because now you're going to be in this space. Trust me, there's not a lot of people in this space. So we're going to go to some people and ask, well, who's the go-to person in near-death experiences? So what got you kind of prompted? It was your background? Was it your training? What gets you interested in NDEs to begin with?
Well, it's kind of funny. It ties back into my journey with Christian publishing, and this would have been probably 7-8 years ago, back when I still worked for Baker Publishing Group. I read a book proposal from my now friend, Randy Kay, who I've done multiple books with and podcasts with for quite a few years. But I got his book proposal for Dying to Meet Jesus. And I was like, why would anybody read this? This former business executive dies and has this experience. Like, I was like, this is dumb. Like, why? How are we even going to market this book? Like, whatever. And like, I was very dismissive and was just like, kind of wrote it off. Like, we ended up working on the book, but I didn't have a lot of enthusiasm for it. Well, within that same year or so, John Burke's New York Times bestselling book, Imagine Heaven, comes out. And I was talking with one of my friends at Baker at a conference recently, and that book's almost to 2 million units sold lifetime, which is crazy. But because that book was doing so well and I worked for Baker, I decided to interview John Burke for my podcast. And he's a rational guy. He's a mechanical engineer by training, and just hearing his story of when his father was dying and starting to just have this want of investigating the space, I was like, okay, there could be something to it. Like, it seemed like there might be something there. Well, a few years later, I move on to a new publishing company, and I happen to be traveling and listen to Randy's audiobook while I'm on a treadmill somewhere in Colorado. and we do a podcast interview. And Randy's really the first near-death experiencer that I get to know, where I see the fruit in his life. I see how his life was transformed, how he's super passionate about telling people about Jesus and doesn't care about money or being executive. And I got to see really the fruit of how his life was changed. And so really it was, starting to do life with Randy after God breathed on that first podcast episode, that kind of opened me up to this world where we started interviewing a bunch of people who'd had experiences. And it was seeing how their lives were transformed, how they were passionate, that really started me going down the rabbit hole. So this is a place I never intended to work in or write books in, but I've been playing in the space now for over 7 years, and I expect I'll be playing in this space probably for the rest of my writing career.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Now, when I look at NDEs, the apologist in me says that there's something about near-death experiences that I think has explanatory power about the past. So I'll give you an example of this. I often will talk about how people will claim that Jesus is just a copycat savior, that he's just a copy of other prior mythologies of dying and rising saviors. Well, so I went back and for one of my books and just looked at the entire series of mythologies. What do they all say in common about God? And you'd be surprised. There's like 15 attributes that every single person who thinks deeply about God ends up kind of imagining God can have this kind of power. Well, you wonder where that comes from. Look, if near-death experiences happen, if we just something's happening that people report, and then they try to make sense of it. And this has been going on for thousands of years. So it wouldn't surprise me then if people who have had near-death experiences see something, imagine something, and then that becomes part of their thinking about the nature of God. And sure enough, there's something. And if there is, I guess what we're looking for, and tell me, Shaun, we're looking for, is there a common experience? Because look, if every one of us had a near-death experience, but they were all radically different, we would make nothing of it. We would say, well, yeah, every person's wired differently, and we imagine these aren't real things. These are just things that come out of our collective experiences. But if we're all having a similar, so I'm always looking for the similarities. Was that an important part of your research?
Yeah, well, just to touch back on what you said a moment ago, near-death experiences have been recorded for thousands of years. And that was one of the new places I got to play in this new book, was to look at ancient near-death experience accounts throughout church history and world history. And people talking about these sorts of experiences go way back further than you think. And so that was not really a surprise to me, but I'd only really dabbled in talking to contemporary near-death experiencers. And so that was a fun place to go in the book. I'll be going there more probably in future works. But in terms of like a structure or a framework, if you will, there's actually a very, very much a rhythm to these experiences. You'll find, if you listen to or watch people sharing a testimony of this kind of an experience, most of them, they have some kind of a catastrophic event that ushers them at or near death. They'll have an out-of-body experience. They'll reach some kind of a threshold. Sometimes it's kind of like a weird liminal space, sort of I say hell's to the left and heaven's to the right, to give it a little bit of a political bent. Sometimes they'll come to like what looks like the gates leading into heaven. They'll encounter what we would refer to in the NDE space as a welcoming committee. So, previously deceased loved ones, their grandparents, parents, friends, family, whatever. Beyond that, people will often encounter God in some aspect of the Trinity. Sometimes it's God the Father, sometimes it's Jesus, sometimes it's even the Holy Spirit. Although the Holy Spirit encounters seem to be a little bit less normal. Usually it's the Father or Jesus. And then you just get into, different sorts of seeing structures in heaven, buildings, people going about normal life, encountering angels, seeing like landscapes that, the grass is singing with and praising God. And people will often tell you they don't have the language to describe it. Like our earthly words just don't capture, what they saw. They're like the colors we have, the words just don't quite capture it. Then I also like to focus on, and this isn't as much talked about in other near-death experience books. What was their re-entry experience like? And some of them are super, super generic. They're like, yeah, I woke up and I was like in the bed in the hospital. And others, like my friend Heidi Barr, she talks about how going back into her body was traumatic and painful, and like Jesus had to like smooth her out so she fit again. And so yeah, there's definitely like in the book, I have this 9-point framework that really, I just give it to readers to be able to process, like, what to expect in an experience, like, what does a normal experience look like? And a lot of the books that have frameworks, they're more in the mainstream side of publishing in the space and not on the Christian side. But what's helpful about having a framework is it kind of allows you to score what's happening in these experiences where like a legitimate experience, you should be able to expect, well, it'll probably have at least 5 or 6 of the 9 or the 10, depending which framework you're looking at. So it's just a quick and easy way I feel to be able to evaluate. And then the last thing I'll add on that is too, it's helpful for me to be able to share stories and talk about it. And I've also shared that with a bunch of people who had these NDEs to say, hey, here's a structure. This might help you be more effective
Okay.
in communicating your story. Because on average, it takes 7 years for somebody to come to terms with what they experience. Like at about the 7-year mark, they've really worked a lot of it out in their head. But it's a progressive journey. I always say, whatever they got in heaven, like their earthly brain can't contain it, and it's a long path to kind of come to terms and figure it out.
Okay, so far, the way you've described your book, it sounds like any number of other NDE books, but this is not that kind of book. I mean, this is a very interesting book because it seems to be, it kind of fits my more skeptical detective kind of mind in the sense that you're calling this an NDE conspiracy. And when I first saw that, I thought, well, is he going to go down this trail where he thinks that there's some ambitious set of co-conspirators, that are out there that is, let's say, let's fool the world and we'll each publish our own book and eventually we'll make all kinds of money together, by pulling. But you're talking about it in terms of how Satan co-ops these stories. So if I didn't know anything about NDE experiences and I saw the cover of your book and amongst all the other books that I might find, I might think from just the title that this is a negative. Like this is you're going to knock down these are all NDE conspiracies. They're all false claims, but that's not what you're doing here. But you are kind of blowing a whistle on some of these experiences that we read about, because I think a lot of us who are skeptical have read at least one or two of these NDEs and said, that doesn't even seem to me to fit the biblical narrative up all that well. And then we become skeptical of all NDEs because we read one or two that we're thinking, maybe this is not theologically sound with our view of Christianity. It could just be that we're from a certain line of theological thought that we say that's a match. But you are taking a relatively skeptical view of NDEs now. And what caused you to do what gave you at least an alarm that said we should be more critical about NDEs?
It really comes back to one of the early interviews that Randy and I did with our friend Brian Melvin, and he drinks some tainted water at a construction site and gets cholera and all this stuff. And he ends up going into this part of his experience where he sees what looks like the house he grew up in. And there's people, Brian, welcome, you're welcome to heaven and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden the experience shifted and the people he saw started shifting and transforming into like demonic creatures. And eventually one of them leads him down into hell. And he talked about how if he had been resuscitated in the early stages of his experience, he would have thought he was fine. He would have thought he was going to go to heaven just like he did when he died the first time. And that's really what set me down this path where, okay, here's this guy who he has this really overt deception happening in his experience. I wonder if there are other deceptions that, could be happening throughout the space. So that's very overt. Where I say it's more covert is you'll have people who they have this near-death experience and they'll tell you, I encountered God and it was this nondescript ball of light that was just a being of love. And it told me that I am in everything and everything is in me and we can do no wrong and all this stuff. And a lot of the theological concepts they tie into pantheism and other non-Christian worldview ideas. And there's this whole body of near-death experience encounters where it's very antithetical to the God of the Bible, what we read in Scripture, like Orthodox Christian theology. And one of the interesting challenges in this space is these people who are heaven experiencers, hell experiences, people have a tendency to want to turn them into like their gurus and their go-to person. And so there's this whole body of work once you start to move outside of the Christian near-death experience space, where people are just being led down dark paths. And I think I know where you want to take me. I'll let you steer the conversation. But again, I attended a mainstream secular conference for NDEs last summer and kind of got to go even further down the rabbit hole and saw stuff I never thought I would see. But once I got out of, we weren't in Kansas anymore. How's that? That's how it felt going to that place.
It's so interesting because there's a couple ways to interpret it, right? So for me, and this, I'm going to ask you how you decided to interpret that, because that's one of the things that's always kept me really kind of at arm's distance, right? My sense of it would be that if this is an eyewitness report, in other words, people die and they see something and they report back. Well, I'm always looking for a couple of things. Number one, do they see something that is surprising yet uniform? So in other words, if we had 20 people who experienced a near-death experience, and they all see things that are part of their culture growing up, they know enough about the Bible, they have certain consonants they all repeat, but they each see something that's unexpected, that I could say, well, look, there's this unexpected thing that they all see that would at least tell me that they're apparently seeing something that's the same. And then I wondered, okay, so would we also see these near-death experiences where it's really has nothing to do with Christianity? And we just kind of wonder, is it everyone just raised in their worldview who has some notion of what death is going to be like that's predictive, and then they experience death and they kind of insert this unconsciously into their experiences? But another way of looking at this, and you're taking the perspective in your book that these are actually deceptions on the part of Satan to confuse us, to draw us away from the real thing. I always saw them and wondered, well, are these just people who realize that there's a cash cow over there? If I can become the guy who died and came back. So I always wonder, well, what percentage of these are just flat lies that people tell, because it puts them, like, if there's no reward, like you saw with Randy, like you're like, okay, so he's having this experience and what's in it for him? Like, what really changes for him, especially when we end up adopting a life then of a more sacrificial life of humility as a Christian who's now devoted to the cause of Christ rather than the cause of Jim. Well, that would, I think, be like unexpected, right? This is what it does. It causes you to surrender more, not to gain more. But there is an industry out there also of people who are gaining more from this kind of status. So I always saw it as human deception. You're seeing it as spiritual deception, right?
Yeah, I think it can be a both and. Right now, because of the popularity of NDEs, I think if you wanted to make a name for yourself and build a platform on it, it's very possible because it's such a hot topic. I think when you look at having a framework, asking hard questions, weighing it against what we read in scripture, orthodox teaching, examining the fruit in that person's life, like that, I think that on a case-by-case basis, you have to kind of pick things apart and go, okay, is this experience making Jesus bigger and brighter and introducing people to him? Or is this experience really geared towards making the person who had this encounter more brighter and beautiful and maybe getting the money? I will say there's still a big stigma on people who've had NDEs. I mean, a lot of my friends who've written and done ministry in this space for a long time will tell you it's not a great place to get rich necessarily, because people treat you weird. They treat you different when you kind of out yourself as having had one of these experiences, especially if you had a negative or a disturbing or distressing near-death experience. I think people kind of judge you like, oh, wow, Jim, you went to hell. You didn't even go to heaven. So there is a hesitancy to share those sorts of stories, let alone just again, it's about a 7-year process to even come to terms with it. People often feel like they don't belong on earth anymore. Like their real home is heaven. So there's a lot of strange tensions that I think unless we've had the experience, we can't quite fully understand what they're
Yeah.
wrestling with. But there's definitely a path to try to make yourself famous with these, but there's a lot of negative fallout in the life of the experiencer too. So it's not all fun and games, if you will.
Well, and so I see your book in some ways as kind of like a guidebook, and it will give you all the positives, all the things we could come away with from near-death experiences and say, okay, there's something in there for me to pay attention to. But your book also will kind of show people, hey, there's also something you need to be careful about, because if you accept this view, and so I don't want to tease out all of it, because that's why, what's the point in doing that if you're going to write a book? Because I think books are where we can deep dive some of these issues. But just give me one kind of aspect of kind of mistaken theology that comes out of some of the near-death experiences. If you aren't critical, if you didn't have a framework, if you didn't have discernment about NDEs, And then I want to ask one question about shared experiences also. But what do you think is one of the things you're seeing that is a kind of a common deception that Satan is using when in twisting some of these experiences?
The probably the biggest is just really bad ideas about God, where almost a lot of it leans into universalism. That it's all
Yeah.
love. It doesn't matter what you do. Everything's going to be fine. One of the encounters I quote briefly in the book is from a woman who has this near-death experience, and the being she encounters and perceives in her mind, or it would be more appropriate, her spirit, because she was dead, as God tells her that rape and murder and all these things that happen on the earth, they're okay. They're just really training for like growth in your spirit or something, and so you'll just see these, lines in some of these testimonies where you're like, that's like purely evil and just very wrong. And so, it can lean into universalism, a lot of it, but there are just these bizarre ideas of non-truths where you're like, okay, this is just out, and you don't even need a theology to go like, well, murder's bad, rape's bad. This cannibalism was another one in that one where it's like, cannibalism isn't bad either. It's just training for, soul growth. And so you just get these weird tangents that seem very like demonic. And that's kind of a norm in a lot of the encounters that kind of don't line up with the Bible. And just what I would also say too is just there are lots of folks who aren't Christian at all, and they'll have these heaven or hell experiences. They've never read the Bible. And what's fun is they'll talk to you about how they, after their experience, they started following Jesus, they started reading the Bible, and they'll start encountering things in Scripture, be like, I saw that in heaven. Oh, I saw that in heaven too. And so
That's the
that's
kind of thing I would think would be
that's
powerful.
an interesting. Is it proof? It's more anecdotal.
Sure.
But they weren't Christian at all, yet they entered into more of a traditional heaven or hell experience, and then it's only later where they discover, oh, that was very biblical.
Well, and it sounds like that's the kind of thing too that will at least be because again, you haven't ingrained this in your mind as a young person growing up in the church, so you have certain expectations, and then sure enough, well, yeah, well, no kidding, you have a biological experience which triggers the same perceptions you had growing up. But I do think this idea of shared experiences, shared death experiences, that's something that maybe you're seeing it more in the literature, but as somebody who's just casually watching from afar, that's not something I had really considered. But maybe this is something that's very standard in the literature. But tell us a little bit about shared death experiences. Why do they
So
matter?
yeah, so Dr. Raymond Moody is kind of the father of the near-death experience space, at least in the last 50 years. So back in the day, his book, like Life After Life, that's where he coins the phrase near-death experiences. His most recent book talks about shared death experiences, and he's in his 80s now, so he's not going to be continuing this research. But he really sees this as the future, in the sense that this is the only aspect of a near-death experience where you can have a third-party verifiable circumstance. And so Moody gives 7 different aspects of that. I only cover 3 of them in my book. One of them is the circumstance where during a person's out-of-body experience, they see what's happening in the ER, the operating room, the waiting room, and when they come back, they're able to tell the doctor or their family member like verbatim conversations that were had. They're able to describe the tools that were being used during the procedures that were being done on them. And, this is in circumstances where they're completely out or maybe even dead. And yet somehow they're in their spirit body, they're able to see these things. And so that's probably the best, like, third party verifiable situation where I think we could do a lot more research in this space just to get at the like veracity and how valid some of these experiences are. Another aspect of this that can be interesting would be in dreams and visions. It's very common for a loved one to, while their loved one is dying, maybe in a different state or across the world, to either encounter their loved one to come say goodbye, like in almost an open vision or in a dream. My friend Heidi Barr, who oddly herself is a near-death experiencer, when she was 16, her horse fell across her chest and she died. When her mother was dying, and this is something she recounts in her recent book, like at the moment her mom was dying, she has a dream of her mom stepping on the train to heaven. It has this very vivid vision of her mom, getting on basically getting on the train to go into the afterlife, if you will. That's a little bit more out of the box, but there are these encounters that people have that connect to the person dying. Another that's interesting too. Sometimes people who are in the same room as a person who is dying, and this is usually in a hospital room, they will actually, like, the atmosphere of the room will shift and they'll start to see what that person's experiencing, like see heaven or see angels in the room or different things like that. And so, some of this I don't know how to explain it or tell you how it works, but there is this whole shared experience phenomenon that manifests in a bunch of different ways. And so that seems like it's kind of the next frontier in the cataloging and research. I don't know that anybody's done a ton of formal studies yet in that space on the Christian side, but for verifiable, where you have somebody besides the experiencer, this is the place you'd probably gain some fruit, so to speak.
Yeah, no, those experiences to me always kind of like the headline experiences on these NDEs, and Gary would sometimes talk about, how could he know what was on that shelf? How could, this idea of having an out of body experience is then somehow verifiable. Okay, so before I kind of turn the corner here, then just all of us when we write these books, we probably write so much of what we do because we're just personally interested. Of course, if you're not personally interested, you probably shouldn't be writing a book anyway, right? Because this is the thing that's driving you to write the book in the first place. But we also have usually some hope that this is going to be fruitful in some way with the church or with those who are maybe investigating the church for the first time. So what are your hopes with this kind of a book? I know you have a personal interest. Clearly, it goes back a number of years. But what do you want the book to do going forward? Like, why even write the book? Tell me what it is you're hoping for.
Probably the primary focus of the book is I want people to avoid deception and avoid being taken down some dark paths. I talk about how not all near-death experiences are created equal. I mean, once you get away from the heaven and hell accounts, you get into some very dark stuff. I went to a major national NDE conference last summer, and probably less than 20% of the content was heaven and hell encounters. A lot of it was psychics and mediums, people talking about how they've helped people reconnect with their lost loved ones and bring them comfort. You have people sharing past and pre-life memories, which is a big aspect of the near-death experience space. You have people sharing about UFO abductions and alien encounters. Oddly, a lot of the alien abduction stories, they're travel narratives, just like a near-death experience. If you try to weigh them against a framework, they actually score pretty well. But there's this whole body of encounters and experiences that has gained massive prominence in our time. And it's just a path unto destruction. In the book, I make the case that a lot of it's very much demonic. For whatever reason, and again, I talk about this in the book. There's 4 stages of demonic activity. Usually like infestation, oppression, obsession, and then full on possession. For some reason, these different folks find that, I make the case, they find themselves a few rungs up the demonic activity ladder. Now, you'd have to investigate their life, see what happens like in their family line, and just, what's going on where they live. For some reason, evil or something demonic was attracted to that person in that space. I don't fully work that out. Like, it's a theory I'm testing in the book, but like in the case of the alien abductions, there are many documented cases where when the person in the midst of the experience cries out to Jesus, the abduction encounter stops and everything just shuts down automatically. And that sort of thing. With the past and pre-life memory circumstance in the past life memory scenarios, for some reason, this happens to occur with children between the ages of 2 and 5. And it starts to go away around the age of 7. And they are remembering things that in a lot of cases are verifiable, like they're remembering the lives of real people. There's an interesting parallel in demonic activity of, demons, pretending to be the spirit of a lost girl who was murdered and she needs you to help her solve her case, kind of a thing. I think what that is for some reason these children are susceptible because of the young age, and there's a familiar spirit manifesting through them for some reason with these memories. Even in the case of pre-life memories, that's one where there's been a lot less research. But I happened to sit in on a keynote with a gentleman sharing his story, and he didn't start having these pre-life memories, kind of his memories in between lives, if you will. But it all started after he began practicing transcendental meditation in his early 30s. And then all of a sudden he started having these pre-life memories. Well, you talk to anybody who's come out of kind of the new age space and been into TDM. TDM is a great way to get yourself filled with demons and that sort of a thing. So I feel like there's a real demonic, deceptive bent into some of these ditches and pitfalls that for, I feel like with Satan's pushing and prompting have become a mainstay in the near-death experience space. And so a big focus of the book is just to equip people so they're not led into error. On the other hand, I do want people to be able to glean the fruit that is available in these experiences because people are very much attracted to this space because they've lost a loved one and they're looking for hope that, their person is fine and in heaven and on the other side. And so, I don't want the dark side to steal away all that hope. Yet, Randy and I through the years have heard so many testimonies of people who, they actually started following Jesus because they listened to one of these encounters, or they got healed in the midst of an interview for some reason, or they've just been in a dark place spiritually and they started praying after watching one of these conversations. So God moves on these encounters and these experiences, and even just sharing the stories in ways that we never expected that he would. And so I don't want Satan to steal kind of the joy and the fruit that's available to people here. But again, there are very dark paths, and it can be very tempting to, go to the psychic or the medium or that kind of a thing to try to reconnect with the lost loved one. Yet it's very clear in Scripture that that is a forbidden path, and it's a path unto destruction. And so, really, trying to expose people to the dark side of this space, which a lot of other writers have not done, especially on the Christian side of the NDE conversation.
Yeah, what I like about your book is that the skeptic in me always saw it as a kind of a polar extremes, right? This is either from God or it's a deception of man, right? So every time there was something that was sideways on one of these explanations, I would just kind of pose it. It falls into all that other stuff you see at these secular conferences involving mediums. It's because often when we would work in law enforcement, where we have psychics in our city, and they have to be licensed as business owners. Isn't that interesting? And they have to go through a licensing process at the police department to become a psychic in a city. And I thought that was, so I would interview some of these folks as they were getting ready to be licensed. And I used to think, okay, so to me, I always saw it as there is some truth that's from God. There is a bunch of lies from humans, and we have to discern between the two. But what's great about your book is that it's really suggesting that these lies may not be from humans. These lies are from another spiritual side of the equation, which I, as a person who was raised as a non-believer, my first go-to is, they're just lying. Not that they're having a spiritual experience that's deceptive. No, they're just being deceptive and creating things that don't exist. So what I love about your book is it kind of opens my mind to the which is really a biblical framework, that there will be spiritual deception. We know it's coming. And it's going to appear in every aspect of our lives, including these NDEs. So why would you be surprised, right? So this book, I think, is really, I commend it to people who are if you're going to read something on NDEs, I think you have to read it with this book, because this book's going to help you have a template, a framework to be able to not be just sucked into especially the popular published versions of NDEs that eventually become movies. Those versions of NDEs are the ones that may not have any foundation. They're not being written by theologians for sure. They're not even being tested. So I think that this is a good book to have as kind of your guidebook through that NDE process. So this is a great book, and I'm glad you wrote it. And I know that with Randy too, you've got somebody there who you trust, who's a co-voice. And it's interesting when you write with somebody long enough that you kind of develop a common voice, a unique voice as a pair. And so I'm glad that I know you've done a couple other books with Randy as well. So this is good that you're doing this one as well.
Yeah, Randy was kind enough to write the introduction for this one. And for us, like this is something we've talked about, somebody needing to write this book for like the past 5 years, just because as we went down the rabbit hole naively, we didn't understand the darkness we were going to encounter. And so I was glad to finally have the opportunity to address that. And I think at the end of the day, again, I want people to encounter Jesus. I want people to grow in their faith, and in anything, as we try to discern what we take in, what we let impact us and affect us, we need to be discerning. And the near-death experience space is no different. Like we really need to know how to enjoy the meat but spit out the bones, just like anything else that could be good but also may have some bad spaces that we could fall into, so to speak. I'll make it easy. You want to find out more about the book, head over to ndeconspiracy.com. I have links there where you can pre-order it. If you'd like to have me on your podcast, I'm glad to do an interview. You can request that there. Heck, you want to have me come speak at a conference? It's all linked up for you right there. Head on over to ndeconspiracy.com and you can find out more about the book.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, thanks, Randy. I really appreciate the fact that Randy's also just writing the form. Sometimes when I've written only one book where I co-authored it, and then there's always this kind of like, do you ever find yourself compromising something you wanted to do? It wasn't my case for me, but I'm just glad that, when you actually know what you're going to write in a book and that's limited to that one piece, well, then you have the freedom to actually explore your ideas more deeply. So yes, that's a great NDE Conspiracy.com. That was, I think, a great opportunity for people to get some discernment in a space that really right now doesn't feel like it has a lot of discernment. So I would commend everyone to go and take a look at that book as well. Good job.
All right. Thanks so much, Jim. I appreciate the interview.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.